Welcome, weary traveller, to a quiet corner of history. Tonight, as the shadows lengthen and the world outside softens into slumber, we'll embark on a journey, not of grand battles or bustling markets, but of whispers and fears, of an invisible tide that reshaped the very foundations of faith and society. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your breath slow and allow your mind to drift back to a time before the storm. We find ourselves now in the early years of the 14th century. Close your eyes, if you like, and simply listen to the echoes of that distant age. It is a time often called the High Middle Ages, a period of profound growth, of architectural ambition, and of deep, unifying faith across the continent we call Europe. The year is perhaps 1340. The world is vast, mysterious, and yet, for the people who walked its dirt roads and navigated its ancient forests, it possessed a profound, almost intimate order. Imagine first the land itself. It is a tapestry of green and brown, endlessly varied, crisscrossed by silver rivers and the enduring stones of Roman roads, now softened by centuries of grass and neglect. The pace of life is slow, deeply ingrained, dictated by the relentless rhythms of the sun and the moon. The great majority of people are farmers, peasants bound, often generationally, to the soil they worked. Their lives were not marked by the calendar days we know, but by the cycle of labor, the planting of the spring barley, the shearing of the summer sheep, and the crucial, wearying labor of the autumn harvest. Their hands were perpetually calloused, their bodies strong from endless toil, yet their hearts were often lightened by the shared work and the comforting predictability of the seasons. Life was hard, yes, but it was understandable. Picture a small village huddled against a hillside. The scent of damp wood smoke hangs perpetually in the cool air, mixing with the damp earth and the sweet smell of animals in their stalls. The houses are humble, built simply of wattle and daub, thatch and timber, clustered together for warmth and companionship against the long nights. But dominating even the tallest oak tree nearby, standing proud and solid at the center of this world, is the church. The church, with its modest bell tower and its deep, cool interior, is the very heartbeat of the community. Its bell does not merely tell the time of Mass. It tolls the hours of the day, signaling when to rise, when to eat the midday meal, and when to pause for the Angelus prayer. It is the communal clock, the spiritual compass, the unwavering anchor in a world often beset by small personal misfortunes and the cyclical uncertainty of the harvest. For these medieval souls, Christian faith was not an abstract philosophy reserved for a Sunday hour. It was the very air they breathed, woven into the deepest fibers of their daily momentary existence. Every sunrise was a reminder of God's grace. Every sudden storm, a potent reminder of His power and the need for immediate supplication. Saints were not distant historical figures. They were almost like spiritual neighbors, appealed to for everything from lost keys to safe childbirth. Saint Christopher for safe travel, Saint Sebastian against pestilence, a familiar threat, but one they believed manageable, and most universally, the gentle intervention of the Virgin Mary. The pervasive belief in the great chain of being, the idea that all of creation was ordered in a fixed hierarchy from God down to the humblest blade of grass, provided a sense of profound stability and meaning. Kings ruled by divine right, lords held their land as faithful stewards, and the peasant worked the earth in a sacred duty. It was a hierarchy that, while often harsh and deeply unequal, was believed to be divinely ordained, offering immense comfort in its certainty and permanence. To know your place in the world was, in a very real sense, to know your straight path to salvation, a destination secured through faithful obedience and the grace of the sacraments. Beyond the quiet villages, a different kind of ambition drove the rising splendor of the cities. Paris, London, Florence, Cologne. These were places of immense ambition, of bustling markets, of new wealth, and a fervent, often impatient intellectual spirit. The air here was louder, filled with the cries of street vendors, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the constant ringing hammers of the craft guilds. These great urban centers were the engines of European growth, drawing people in with the promise of trade and opportunity, yet already straining desperately under the sheer density of their own rapidly increasing population. And in the heart of these great urban centers stood the magnificent Gothic cathedrals. Think of Chartres or the towering spires of Cologne reaching impossibly toward the heavens. These were not merely buildings, stone and mortar. They were vast, shimmering testaments to collective faith and human ingenuity. Every carved stone, every dizzying stained glass window that poured jewel-toned light onto the floor, every soaring vaulted ceiling was an offering, a way to experience the majesty of the divine in physical, overwhelming form. Their construction spanned generations, a shared devotion that unified the powerful bishop with the humblest stonemason in one common, sacred purpose. Now, let us turn our minds to the spiritual guardians of this world, the monastic orders. Dotted across the landscape, often in remote, tranquil valleys, were the monasteries and convents, the quiet powerhouses of the medieval church. Here, away from the world's noise and avarice, a different kind of perpetual labor took place, the sacred work of prayer, preservation, and contemplation. Picture the interior of a scriptorium in a Benedictine abbey. The only sounds are the rhythmic scratching of a quill on parchment, perhaps the soft, repetitive turning of pages, and the distant low cadence of chanting from the chapel. Brother Elias, bent over his desk, works patiently by the pale afternoon light. He is copying ancient texts, preserving the wisdom of the classical world alongside the profound writings of the Church Fathers. His work is agonizingly slow, meticulous, a lifetime given to ink and vellum, a meditation in permanence that demands infinite patience and humility. This silent labor ensured that knowledge, medicine, history, and theology were not lost to the sudden chaotic impulses of the age. The monasteries were not just places of prayer, they were beacons of civilization, learning, and organized charity. The Church, at this point in the 14th century, held an authority that is nearly impossible to imagine today. It was the single, unifying umbrella under which all of Western Europe lived and died. It dictated the calendar, the fasts, the moral code, and the ultimate destiny of every soul. It was the sole provider of education, the chief source of charity, the final arbiter of law and morality when secular courts failed. It cared for the sick in its rudimentary hospitals, sheltered travelers, and offered the only real path to social mobility. The Pope, even during the complex and often criticized period of the Avignon papacy, was the supreme spiritual monarch, his pronouncements holding the terrible binding weight of eternal law. However, this period of growth and confidence was not without its internal stresses. Beneath the polished veneer of high medieval society, tensions were beginning to emerge that suggested a reckoning might be due, though no one could have predicted its form. The very success and immense wealth of the Church had led in some high quarters to corruption and complacency. Voices of dissent, like early reformers and evangelical preachers, pointed to bishops living like princes and the scandalous practice of selling spiritual offices, the sin of simony. There was a growing visible gap between the simple, sincere piety of the village priest who lived meagerly among his flock, and the elaborate political machinations and worldly luxury of the papal curia. This gap was a source of quiet spiritual anxiety. Furthermore, Europe had, for centuries, enjoyed a period of unprecedented population growth. This demographic success, a testament to better farming and relative peace, was now creating its own silent crisis. More people meant more mouths to feed, and the land was already beginning to struggle to keep pace with the demand for grain. This population pressure made the society biologically and economically brittle. The harrowing memory of the Great Famine of the early 14th century, a decade of brutal weather and crop failure, was still a source of trauma. That earlier catastrophe had already weakened the populace, leaving an entire generation with stunted growth and, most dangerously, compromised immune systems, unknowingly preparing the ground for a far greater biological devastation. And finally, the world was becoming smaller in a way that was both wondrous and terrifyingly interconnected. Trade routes, known collectively as the Silk Road, now stretched in a complex web of land and sea lanes from the bustling harbors of the Mediterranean deep into the exotic heart of Asia. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan merchants risked incredible danger and expense to bring spices, jewels, and the coveted shimmering silks of Cathay back to European markets. These routes symbolized prosperity, connection, and the adventurous spirit of the age, a relentless, hungry quest for global reach. But no one, not the learned scholar in his library, the savvy merchant counting his gold, nor the devout priest kneeling at the altar, could have comprehended that these arteries of commerce were also serving as invisible highways for a microscopic passenger. This passenger, a tiny, silent force of nature, was traveling faster and farther than any king's messenger or merchant's caravan. It was riding on the backs of tiny creatures, making its steady, inevitable way towards the unsuspecting continent. The Europe of 1340 was confident, devout, and bustling. It felt to its inhabitants like a solid, well-built home, a permanent fixture in the divine plan. They lived with the certainties of their faith and the familiarity of their traditions, utterly unaware that their foundation was about to be shaken to its core by an enemy that did not carry a sword or ride a horse, but moved on the breath of a flea and the stillness of a shadow. It was the quiet, unsuspecting calm before the most profound storm in their history, a profound, terrible silence before the sound of the death bell would drown out all others. The collective Christian soul was primed for challenge, for suffering, for war, for famine, all known quantities, all things that could be addressed through prayer or arms, but not for this unseen, indiscriminate force. Not for a sickness that mocked all piety, that struck with equal fury against the consecrated ground of the monastery and the mud floor of the peasant's hut. The deepest assurance of the medieval Christian was that suffering had meaning. It was a test, a penance, a path to purification. The plague would challenge this meaning itself. It would ask, what is the meaning of suffering when it is random, overwhelming, and utterly pointless? But that question lay yet in the future, waiting patiently, silently. For now, the world waited, bathed in the soft light of its unsuspecting morning. We leave this part of our journey now with the image of a world at its height, rich, faithful, ordered, but standing at a precise and terrible historical hinge. The foundation is secure, but the walls are already beginning to vibrate, waiting for the first wave of that unseen storm to break upon the shores of the Christian world. We turn now to the precise moment when the comfort of this world shattered, and the invisible enemy made its terrifying entrance. The year is 1347. The gentle hum of the world we just described, the assured rhythms of faith and harvest, is about to be violently interrupted, and the focus of world history shifts with terrible suddenness to the deep blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, where the great arteries of European commerce pulsed with life and profit, and a deadly, silent passenger. Imagine the harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily. It is a place teeming with life. The sun is warm on the ancient stones, and the air is thick with the scent of salt and the heady aroma of exotic spices brought in by the long-distance traders. The docks are a vibrant, living chaos of commerce, the shouts of stevedores, the ringing of coin, the multilingual haggling of merchants. It is late October when a small fleet of Genoese trading ships arrives, vessels known variously as cogs or galleys. They have made the long, arduous journey from the distant ports of the Black Sea, perhaps last touching land at the Crimean trading outpost of Kaffa, a place where the seeds of this plague had already been sown by Mongol siege. As these ships pulled alongside the busy wharves, their arrival was immediately, unnervingly different. It wasn't the usual joyous chaos of a successful return. It was silent. A silence so profound it was in itself a kind of terrible noise. The people of Messina, accustomed to the rough and tumble of the sea, would have quickly noticed the profound stillness on deck. The merchants who finally staggered onto the gangplanks were not hearty and boastful. They were feverish, delirious, and terrified. Many of the crew were already dead, their bodies lying below decks, cold and stiff, hastily covered. Those still alive carried the unmistakable, horrifying marks of an unknown enemy. Hushed whispers began to pass from dock worker to dock worker. They spoke of the sailors' symptoms. First, a terrible, relentless fever, so hot it seemed to burn the life right out of the man. Then, deep, unbearable aches throughout the body, followed by vomiting and a profound mental confusion. But the most agonizing, terrifying signs were the buboes. Strange, dark, swollen lumps the size of an apple or a large hen's egg, appearing with dreadful certainty in the armpits, the groin, and the neck. These black swellings were the visible, agonizing signature of the unseen killer. They gave the disease its eventual simple name, the bubonic plague. The officials of Messina, wise in the ways of dealing with seafaring sickness, acted with a desperate speed. Recognizing that this was no ordinary illness, they ordered the death ships to be towed away from the docks and quarantined at sea. Yet, in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the medieval port, this action was already irrevocably too late. The deadly cargo had already been delivered. The disease had already disembarked, carried not by the sick merchants themselves, but by tiny, silent passengers. The long journey from Asia had been shared by Rattus rattus, the ubiquitous black rat, which thrived in the dark, warm holds of the ships. And on the back of the rat travelled the true microscopic courier of death, the oriental rat flea. When the rats, sickened and dying from the contagion, began to expire in the holds or on the docks, their parasitic companions, the fleas, sought new warmth and blood. They hopped ashore, finding their new host in the dense, warm body of humanity, a plentiful source. A simple, often unnoticed bite was all that was needed to pass the microscopic enemy, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, from the flea into the human bloodstream. And the devastation began its quiet, devastating work. The speed with which the plague took hold in Messina was terrifying. It moved from the docks into the closest, most crowded districts, where homes were packed tightly together and sanitation was non-existent. Within days, what had been isolated cases on the ships became dozens, then hundreds, of sick citizens. The local physicians, relying on the ancient medical theories of humours and imbalances, of hot, cold, wet and dry, were utterly helpless. They tried bloodletting, strange herbal poultices, and fervent prayers, but nothing stopped the rapid, agonizing progress of the sickness. Here in Messina, the first true crisis of faith began to unfold for the masses. The people, deeply devout and accustomed to the omnipresence of the Church, instinctively turned to God. They demanded solemn processions and fervent public prayer, believing the plague was a spiritual affliction, a direct, unmistakable divine punishment for the collective sins of the city and the world. Priests, wearing their vestments, knowing the immense personal risk, bravely walked into the homes of the sick to hear confessions and administer the last sacraments. This was the sacred duty of the clergy, their holy pact with the community, to guide the soul through its final earthly moments and assure its passage to eternity. But this act of profound piety came at a terrible, agonizing cost. The priests who entered the sick rooms quickly became sick themselves. The very act of offering spiritual comfort transformed the clergy into the most tragic, high-risk group. The mortality rate among the priesthood in those first terrible weeks was staggering, leaving communities suddenly not just physically ill, but profoundly spiritually orphaned and abandoned. Picture a young priest, perhaps named Brother Pietro, who had felt a powerful and sincere call to serve the suffering. He moves through the darkening streets, carrying his holy oil and his crucifix, hearing the muffled screams of the afflicted. He is afraid, certainly, but his sacred duty, his vocation, demands his presence, and he finds a terrible courage in the face of certain death. Yet, after hearing the confession of a dying mother and receiving the breath of her sickness, he feels the telltale fever rise in his own blood, the awful sickening throb beneath his armpit. The certainty of his faith, though remaining, is challenged by the indiscriminate reality of his fate. He sought to save souls, but the plague sought simply to take life, regardless of holiness, courage, or rank. The people of Messina, seeing their spiritual guides struck down with the same swiftness as the common dock worker, were seized by a primal, overwhelming terror. Fear became its own contagion, spreading faster than the physical disease. They saw the buboes and the black spots, the terrible, inevitable tokens of death, appear on healthy people, and knew with terrible certainty that the end was near. The initial response was flight. Driven by panic and a desperate will to survive, the healthy abandoned the city. They loaded carts with their meager belongings and fled inland, or sought passage on small vessels to nearby towns and neighboring coasts. This desperate diaspora, however, was precisely what the plague needed. Like wind catching a small spark, the fleeing citizens carried the infected fleas and the contagion to the surrounding countryside and, crucially, to the major trading centers of the Italian mainland. Within weeks, the ports of Genoa and Pisa were struck. Then the jewel of the Adriatic, Venice, that shining city built upon water. The canals, once glorious waterways of commerce and festival, began to fill with the bodies of the dead. Venice was one of the first cities to attempt a large-scale public health measure. They quickly established isolation areas, lazarettos, on nearby islands, attempting to quarantine the sick and the newly arrived. But even these brave, pioneering efforts could not halt the relentless march of the invisible foe. The arrival of the plague was more than a medical event. It was a psychological and theological earthquake. It exposed the profound vulnerability of the medieval world's beautiful, fragile order. All the systems designed to protect the people, the social hierarchy, the medical remedies, and even the spiritual assurances of the Church seemed to buckle under the weight of this unseen, irrational terror. The world had been certain of its purpose. Now it was certain only of its impending doom. And the sheer scale of the death meant that the fundamental Christian rituals were the first casualties. How could the community bury the dead in consecrated ground with the proper solemn rites when dozens were dying in a single hour? How could the necessary prayers be said when the very hands meant to hold the scriptures were cold. The necessity of mass graves, unconsecrated pits hurriedly dug outside the city walls, represented a deep wound to the medieval soul, a violation of the sacred duty to the departed. This practical impossibility underscored the profound theological crisis. God's usual predictable order of life and death seemed to have utterly vanished. And so the quiet life of the Mediterranean ports was utterly transformed into a scene of chaotic fear and agonizing grief. The gates of the prosperous medieval world, so secure in their faith and their trade, had been unknowingly thrown wide open to an enemy far older and more patient than any king or army. The arrival was merely the painful, terrifying prelude to the long, dark years ahead, years that would test the very essence of Christian endurance. Once the unseen enemy had established its first terrible foothold on the docks of Messina, its progression was neither chaotic nor random. It was relentless and systematic. It followed the very lines of connection and commerce that the medieval world had so proudly built. The spread of the Black Death across Europe was not merely a geographical movement. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of distance itself. Imagine the map of Europe as a vast, living, nervous system. The plague was a poison injected into its most vital arteries, and the poison flowed swiftly. From the port cities of Sicily and southern Italy, the disease spread rapidly up the coastline, carried by the ships that fled the initial outbreaks, bearing both their lucrative cargo and their fatal, secret contagion. In the early months of 1348, the plague turned its attention to the economic and cultural heartlands. Florence, Rome, and Venice, cities that represented the pinnacle of wealth, art, and ecclesiastical power, were engulfed one after the other in a tide of darkness. Take the city of Florence, the proud center of the nascent Renaissance spirit. Normally a hive of intellectual and mercantile energy, its streets now filled with a different kind of commerce, the grim, overwhelming business of the dead. The great city, already densely populated, found its air thick with the smell of sickness, fear, and the smoke from constant, improvised funeral pyres. People wrote of the bewildering speed of the disease. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy, dine with friends in the midday sun, and be dead by nightfall. The symptoms were so swift, so brutal, that they seemed to defy natural explanation, reinforcing the terrifying belief that this was no ordinary sickness, but the direct, wrathful hand of God. The natural human instinct in the face of disaster, to comfort, to care, to mourn, was shattered by the paralyzing fear of contagion. Chroniclers recorded scenes of heartbreaking abandonment. Husbands fled their feverish wives, mothers abandoned their sick children, and neighbors refused to attend the bedsides of their dearest companions. The most sacred bonds of community and family dissolved under the acid bath of terror. In this darkness, self-preservation, stripped of charity, became the only unbreakable law. This phenomenon was a profound spiritual crisis as much as a physical one. Christianity taught absolute charity, neighborly love, and the sacred duty to tend to the sick. Yet the plague forced a terrifying, agonizing choice. Obey God's command to love your neighbor and risk almost certain death, or save your life and commit the terrible sin of abandonment and impiety. Many in their terror chose the path of life, and their resultant guilt, their internal agony, was another invisible toll extracted by the disease from the human soul. The spread moved next along the great overland routes. From Italy, it crossed the rugged Alps and penetrated deep into France. Its arrival was a cataclysmic shock in the city of Avignon, the seat of the papacy at the time, the very center of Western Christendom. The papal court was thrown into immediate, unprecedented chaos. Pope Clement VI, though undoubtedly terrified by the proximity of the pestilence, attempted to maintain spiritual and temporal order. He resorted to extraordinary, desperate measures. Seeing the sheer volume of the dead, he consecrated the entire river Rhone so that the bodies, too numerous for burial in holy ground, could be thrown into its waters, granting them at least a form of spiritual cleansing. The sight of the spiritual capital resorting to such desperate utilitarian actions only underscored the sheer magnitude of the disaster gripping the Christian world. From France, the plague branched out along the ancient military roads and merchant trails. It moved south into Spain, ravaging the kingdoms of Catalonia and Castile. It moved west toward the English Channel, its advance a shadow that preceded it, fueling rumor and prayer. The journey across the narrow seas to England in the summer of 1348 was, by then, inevitable. It landed first in the southern ports, likely in Dorset or along the coastline, carried by the usual flow of trade, and then began its slow, inexorable crawl inland, traveling not always swiftly, but always steadily, following the lanes and rivers. By early 1349, it had reached London. The capital, with its crowded, unsanitary streets, its houses built close with little light, and its dense population of over 50,000 people, was a perfect tinderbox for contagion. The air in the city, already foul, became lethal. Chroniclers describe bodies piling up faster than the carts could be brought to carry them, the stench overwhelming the city's life. The usual noises of the capital, the cheerful cries of the market, the boastful songs of the tavern, were replaced by the monotonous, chilling sound of the death bell, which rang so constantly it eventually lost all specific meaning, becoming merely the sonic background to human despair. The living simply learned to ignore it, a quiet acceptance of the terrible, endless toll. Imagine the small human story within this grand catastrophe, the individual tragedy that scaled up to millions. Think of John, a humble messenger who carried mail between two English shires. His life was one of routine danger, bad roads, bandits, severe weather. He knew how to survive those things, he could see them coming. But when he arrived in a new town carrying letters, he carried more than just correspondence. He carried the disease. He might not even be sick himself yet, but the tiny dark traveller on his cloak or in the hay of his stable was the advance guard. John would deliver his message, accept payment, and ride on, perhaps feeling a little feverish, leaving behind him a seed of death that would sprout 3 days later, long after he had gone down the road to the next town. The innocent became the agent of the apocalypse. The plague continued its northward and eastward spread. Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, Germany, and into Eastern Europe. It moved relatively slower in sparsely populated areas like the high plateaus and remote forests, but no region connected by the vast network of Christian trade was truly safe, especially any place connected by a navigable river or a major land route. Crucially, the disease struck with absolute terrifying impartiality. It claimed the peasant and the prince, the merchant and the monk, the virtuous and the vile. The records show that the mortality among the wealthy and powerful, who could afford better food and isolation, was only marginally lower than among the poorest. This terrifying lack of discrimination fueled the deepest spiritual fear. If this was God's judgment, as the priests preached, why did the holiest people die first? Why did the dedicated, charitable priest perish alongside the common thief? Why did entire monasteries, filled with souls dedicated to prayer and poverty, become empty tombs? This question, the question of divine justice in the face of random suffering, eroded the medieval understanding of sin and order, opening a deep philosophical chasm beneath the surface of the crisis. By the end of 1349 and into 1350, the Black Death had swept through the overwhelming majority of the known European world. Estimates vary widely, lost to the chaos of the time, but a consensus suggests that between 30% and 50% of the entire population perished, perhaps 25 million people or more, in just over 2 years. The speed of this demographic destruction has no true parallel in history. The spread of the plague was more than a mortality event. It was the unraveling of the entire social and economic tapestry that had been so carefully woven over centuries. In its wake, fertile fields lay fallow, courts ceased to function for lack of judges and clerks, and the great institutions of society struggled simply to survive. The most visible institution facing this existential struggle, and the one whose very identity was rooted in spiritual certainty, was the Church. The relentless spread had now brought the invisible enemy directly to the door of every sanctuary, every abbey, and every devout heart. The time for institutional reckoning had arrived. In a world where the Church was not merely an institution, but the very scaffold of existence, the keeper of time, the source of law, the pathway to heaven, the arrival of the Black Death presented an existential crisis that went far beyond mere logistics. How does the shepherd confront a wolf that cannot be seen, cannot be fought with steel, and seems to strike with total terrifying impunity against the holiest of souls? The initial response of the Church was predictable, rooted in centuries of tradition and theology, prayer, penitence, and procession. When faced with natural disaster, famine, flood, or localized pestilence, the medieval mind, guided by the pulpit, interpreted it as a sign of divine wrath. The plague, therefore, must be a punishment for the collective sins of humanity, a final, terrible warning. Bishops and archbishops across Europe issued immediate edicts. They commanded days of strict fasting, They ordered all the faithful to engage in fervent prayer, confession, and acts of penance. Great processional pilgrimages were organized, winding through the city streets. Thousands marched, barefoot and robed in sackcloth, weeping, chanting litanies of sorrow, and begging for God's mercy and immediate intervention. Imagine the sound of such a procession in a city like Paris or Florence. The monotonous, mournful cadence of the Kyrie eleison, the soft dragging of bare feet on cobblestones, the mingled smell of incense and unwashed bodies. This was the public communal face of medieval piety, the society trying to atone its way out of disaster. The people looked to the church not just for ritual, but for a theological explanation, a coherent narrative to make sense of the meaningless death. But the plague did not respect the processions. It struck those who marched as readily as those who watched from windows. The very act of gathering large groups for prayer became, unknowingly, a vector of transmission, turning the act of worship into an act of self-condemnation. The crisis deepened when the plague targeted the clergy itself. The primary duty of the priest was to administer the sacraments, the keys to salvation, especially confession and extreme unction, last rites. To fulfill this sacred duty, the priests had to enter the sick room, to lean close to the dying, to receive the last breath of the infected soul. They performed this duty with extraordinary, heartbreaking courage, a bravery born of absolute conviction. The result was an appalling mortality rate. Priests, monks, and nuns died in numbers far exceeding the general population. In some dioceses, particularly those hit hardest in Italy and France, up to 2/3 of the clergy perished. Entire monasteries, self-contained communities of piety and learning, were wiped out almost completely. The Black Death was not just killing Christians, it was killing the intermediaries of Christianity. Consider the profound psychological impact of this spiritual vacuum. In an era when salvation was believed to be inextricably linked to receiving the final sacraments, absolution from sin, anointing with oil, the sudden terrible scarcity of priests was a source of agonizing anxiety for the dying. Dying without absolution meant risking eternal damnation. And now the path to absolution was literally closed off, not by sin, but by biology. Chroniclers recorded desperate measures. Lay people, the healthy, were given emergency theological instruction on how to hear a confession or administer baptism when a priest was unavailable. Dying citizens would stand outside the windows of a bishop's house, shouting their sins to the street, begging for general absolution. The Church, recognizing the spiritual emergency, granted unprecedented dispensations. Pope Clement VI, in a radical act of mercy, decreed that all those who died of the plague and were confessed, or even wished they could confess, were granted plenary remission of all their sins. This action, though deeply merciful, highlighted the institutional strain. The plague forced the Church to break its own rules, to prioritize divine mercy over sacred ritual. This theological fluidity, while comforting the masses in the short term, would later contribute to questions about the necessity of the priestly class itself. If a layperson could hear confession, and if God granted mass absolution, what did this say about the absolute necessity of the Church's earthly structure? The logistical nightmare extended to burial. Traditionally, every baptized soul deserved burial in consecrated ground, usually the churchyard. The sheer volume of the dead, however, quickly overwhelmed this practice. Churchyards filled within weeks. The digging of individual graves became physically impossible. Bodies lay unburied in homes, streets, and fields. The stench was unbearable, and the danger of further pestilence was clear. Again, the Church was forced to resort to desperate expediency. They oversaw the digging of vast mass graves, deep, wide trenches outside the city walls. The clergy, even in their diminished numbers, attempted to consecrate these communal pits from a safe distance. The faithful found this deeply disturbing. The lack of a proper personal funeral rite for a loved one, the sight of bodies being dumped unceremoniously, violated the deepest spiritual duties of the family and the Church. It was a visual symbol of God's order having broken down. The loss of educated and experienced clergy created a crisis of clerical quality. As the plague receded, the Church had to quickly ordain replacements to serve the remaining population. New priests and monks were rushed through seminaries, often receiving only minimal training in theology, canon law, and basic pastoral care. This influx of less educated and sometimes less pious clergy further lowered the spiritual quality of the institution in the decades immediately following the plague, making it harder for the Church to command the respect and authority it once had. The terror and the sense of divine abandonment also led to the rise of fringe spiritual movements, which the Church struggled to control. The most prominent were the flagellants, groups of fanatics who marched in public processions, stripping to the waist and scourging themselves with metal-tipped whips. They believed that by inflicting intense collective physical pain upon themselves, they could offer a public penance so profound that it would finally appease God's wrath and halt the plague. These movements spread quickly through Germany and the Low Countries. They offered a visceral, immediate, and direct relationship with suffering and atonement, bypassing the institutional Church entirely. They preached a radical message of imminent doom and demanded repentance now. While the processions themselves were intense acts of faith, their theology was simplistic and often dangerously heretical. The flagellants often claimed that their leaders were divinely inspired and that their self-punishment granted them power over sin, a direct challenge to the Pope's authority to grant absolution. Furthermore, the flagellants were a major vector for social violence. Driven by their apocalyptic fervor, they often preached that the plague was caused by scapegoats, most notably the Jewish communities. They accused Jewish people of poisoning wells and spreading the disease, leading to terrible widespread pogroms and massacres across the German territories and eastern France. The institutional Church, often represented by Pope Clement VI, actively and repeatedly condemned the violence against the Jews, issuing papal bulls that prohibited the massacres and insisted on the divine origin of the plague. However, in the atmosphere of total panic and theological anarchy, the Pope's distant word often held less sway than the fiery accusations of the street preachers. The ultimate confrontation the Church faced was not with the plague itself, but with the question of theodicy, the problem of evil and suffering. Why does an all-powerful, all-loving God permit such catastrophic, random suffering, especially on the good and the holy? The traditional answer, it is a test or a punishment for sin, rang hollow when entire congregations of devout people were annihilated. When a saintly nun died swiftly while a notorious sinner survived, the old, neat theological frameworks began to crumble in the popular imagination. The plague suggested that God's justice was unfathomable and terrifyingly arbitrary, shattering the comfortable, predictable contract between the faithful and their Creator. The institutional Church, having failed to physically stop the plague or fully explain it in traditional terms, lost immense moral and intellectual authority. The result was not a collapse of Christianity, but a fundamental shift in spiritual gravity. Faith did not die. Instead, it became less centralized, less institutional, and much more personal, intense, and individual. The surviving faithful began to look inward. They sought a more direct, intimate, and often emotional relationship with Christ, bypassing the layers of hierarchy that had failed them. They focused on the personal suffering of Jesus, the man of sorrows, whose agony on the cross suddenly seemed immediate and relatable. They craved certainty that only a personal reckoning with God could provide, not through the elaborate, distant political machinery of the papacy, but through genuine, heartfelt devotion. This confrontation with the invisible enemy, therefore, did not destroy the faith, but radicalized it. It forced the Church into crisis and simultaneously forged a deeper, more urgent piety in the hearts of the survivors. The institutions might be shaken, the ranks of the clergy decimated, but the core need for spiritual meaning, for salvation, only grew more desperate and more powerful. The stage was set for a new era where the individual soul, isolated by fear and suffering, would find new ways to connect to the divine. In the suffocating, silent grip of the Black Death, the human heart became the most profound and terrible battlefield. Here, primal, overwhelming fear wrestled fiercely with the deepest convictions of Christian faith. This was an age where God's presence was felt intimately in every sunrise, every thunderstorm, every birth, where heaven and hell were not metaphors but vividly painted, tangible realities, and where sin was believed to carry immediate, visceral, and collective consequences. So when the plague arrived with the swiftness of an assassin and the totality of a great flood, it was almost universally interpreted through the only lens available: theological reckoning. It was not a medical disaster. It was an act of divine judgment, a celestial hammer brought down upon a sinful world. Imagine the pulpits across Europe. The sermons were uniform in their message, delivered by terrified yet resolute surviving priests. They preached that the plague was God's righteous anger, the terrible punishment for humanity's avarice, pride, and moral decay. This message, intended to inspire immediate, profound repentance, also fueled an intense, often paralyzing existential fear among the populace. If God was so wrathful, so determined to cleanse the earth, how could any single fallible soul possibly escape his anger? The terror was rooted not just in the certainty of physical death, a familiar concept to medieval people, but in the terrifying uncertainty of the afterlife. Dying without confession and absolution meant eternal damnation, a torment infinitely worse than the brief agony of the buboes. This led to a desperate, chaotic scramble for spiritual certainty. People flocked to the churches, sometimes so crowded that the very air became a source of danger. They sought confession with frantic urgency, lining up for hours, confessing not just their sins but those of their neighbors, seeking to shed any burden that might tip the scales against them on Judgment Day. The sacrament of confession became an urgent, almost frenzied ritual, a final, desperate plea for a clean slate. But this fear manifested itself in two profoundly different, almost contradictory ways, tearing the moral fabric of society. On one side, the fear drove people to unprecedented acts of piety and desperate asceticism. We have already touched upon the flagellants, who became the physical, screaming embodiment of this terror. They offered a radical, visible form of penance, traveling from town to town, chanting hymns of sorrow and flagellating themselves until their blood stained the streets. They were a terrifying spectacle, yet people often knelt to receive their blessing, seeing them as saints who had taken on the world's suffering. For the individual, this piety expressed itself in intense devotion to the Virgin Mary and saints associated with protection, like Saint Sebastian and Saint Roche. Saint Sebastian, frequently depicted surviving martyrdom by arrows, was suddenly invoked as a shield against the arrows of the plague. Saint Roche, who had nursed the sick and then showed the bubo on his own leg, became the patron saint of plague sufferers, the ultimate symbol of courageous charity and endurance. People sought physical, tangible comfort in the face of invisible death. Relics, bones, fragments of cloth or dust from holy sites were desperately revered and kissed, despite the clear danger of contagion. Vows were made to go on pilgrimages if they survived. Land and wealth were bequeathed to the church in exchange for prayers for the dead. The focus narrowed to salvation at any cost. On the other side of the moral spectrum, fear drove people to abandonment and hedonism. If death was arbitrary, if piety offered no protection, and if divine order had crumbled, then the future was meaningless. For some, the only logical response was to seize the fleeting moment. This led to a brief, grim flourishing of fatalistic debauchery. Chroniclers, such as the famous Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio in his Decameron, described groups of young, wealthy Florentines who retreated to country villas. They decided that since life was short and death inevitable, they would spend their remaining days feasting, drinking fine wine, telling bawdy stories, and ignoring the terror outside their walls. This was not necessarily a rejection of faith, but a temporary suspension of morality, a desperate attempt to find joy and forgetfulness in the shadow of the grave. If judgment was coming regardless, why not spend the final hours enjoying God's creation rather than fearing His wrath? The profound difficulty here was that both piety and debauchery often led to the same grim end. The ascetic flagellant marching in a crowded procession and the hedonist feasting in a closed room were equally susceptible to the tiny, invisible flea. The arbitrary nature of the outcome only amplified the existential terror, making it impossible to confidently link moral behavior to survival. Perhaps the darkest manifestation of fear was the search for a scapegoat. The medieval mind was not equipped to grasp microbial disease. Therefore, the devastation had to be the work of malicious human agents. Whispers spread like wildfire, fueled by panic and pre-existing prejudices. Accusations centered primarily on Jewish communities. They were accused of poisoning the public wells, of striking a pact with the devil, or of casting malevolent spells. These baseless rumors, which defied all logic, Jewish people were dying at the same rates, sometimes higher, as their Christian neighbors, led to horrific, spontaneous outbreaks of violence. Across Germany, Switzerland, and eastern France, pogroms erupted. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were tortured and brutally murdered in an attempt to halt the disease. The terrifying irony was that these acts of violence, by gathering large crowds, only further facilitated the spread of the plague. The spiritual leaders of the Church, despite the actions of a few local fanatics, largely condemned these atrocities. Pope Clement VI was explicit in his opposition, issuing papal bulls stating firmly that the plague was a divine judgment or a natural event, not the work of Jews. He threatened excommunication for anyone who participated in the attacks. Yet, in the absence of law and the presence of hysterical fear, the Pope's distant words often provided little protection. The terrible choice between faith's teaching, charity, and non-violence, and fear's impulse, find and destroy the enemy, was made again and again, tragically favoring the latter. This spiritual crisis profoundly impacted the visual and intellectual culture of the time. Before the plague, medieval art often focused on the majestic, triumphant Christ, the Pantocrator, the king. But after the plague, there was a powerful melancholic shift towards the suffering, relatable Jesus, the man of sorrows. This imagery focused intensely on Christ's wounds, his agony on the cross, his shared humanity. Why this shift? Because the survivors could suddenly relate. They had witnessed unendurable agony, seen loved ones mutilated by sickness. The glorious, distant king felt unreachable. But the suffering Christ, who had endured bodily torment and died a terrifying death, became the ultimate companion in grief. His sacrifice was seen not just as a one-time event, but as a perpetual, empathetic presence in their current misery. The focus moved from fear of his judgment to identification with his pain. Furthermore, the omnipresent reality of death inspired the danse macabre, or the dance of death. This artistic motif, which appeared in paintings, frescoes, and poetry across Europe, depicted a line of figures, kings, popes, merchants, peasants, children, all being led by a skeletal death figure in a grim, joyful dance. It was a stark, powerful theological statement. Death equalizes all ranks. It was a way for the survivors to process the plague's terrifying impartiality, to affirm that while life might be unfair, death itself, and thus God's eventual final judgment, would be just and uniform. The individual Christian, isolated by the terror, began a long inward journey. The failure of the institutional church to protect the body and its near failure to protect the soul made the private internal relationship with God paramount. This was the birth of a more intense, emotional, and internalized piety. Individuals sought direct spiritual communion, often through prayer, reading devotional books, and mystical contemplation. The terror of the plague had, paradoxically, forced a level of spiritual maturity. The survivors realized that faith could not be delegated to a priest or a bishop. It had to be their own possession, their own defense. They were left to ask the deep, agonizing questions that the catastrophe forced upon them. If I am spared, why? What is the purpose of this borrowed time? How do I live now, knowing the fragility of the world and the capriciousness of the end? Faith and fear, therefore, did not cancel each other out. They intensified each other. The fear was terrifying precisely because the faith was so strong. The possibility of eternal damnation made the bodily fear of death pale in comparison. Yet the enduring power of Christian faith, even when deeply bruised and questioned, allowed for acts of incredible, self-sacrificial charity. Alongside the stories of abandonment were countless unrecorded stories of quiet courage. A simple woman sharing her last loaf of bread, a father burying his neighbor's child because no one else would, the anonymous lay volunteers who risked their lives to carry water to the afflicted. These small, often unseen acts of radical compassion became the true flickering lights of Christian endurance. They affirmed that even when the whole world seemed to be a manifestation of divine wrath, the core tenets of love and mercy could still find expression in the human heart. This agonizing collision between faith and fear redefined the spiritual contract of the West. It shifted the focus from the collective community to the solitary, endangered soul. It exposed the deep flaws within the church hierarchy, and it laid the necessary painful groundwork for a century and a half of intense spiritual introspection that would eventually blossom into the great religious movements that followed. The terror was immense, but the spiritual change it wrought was indelible and powerful. And then, as swiftly and mysteriously as it had arrived, the terrible first wave of the plague began to recede. Not with a definitive ringing end, but with a gradual, agonizing winding down, leaving behind it a landscape utterly transformed, a landscape of profound, echoing silence. This was not the silence of peace, but a heavy, aching void where the memory of noise was louder than any sound. Imagine the sights and sounds of this immediate aftermath. The unrelenting, mournful tolling of the death bell had finally ceased. But the new quiet was more terrifying. The fields, once bustling with laborers at the plough, were now overgrown with weeds, lying fallow and forgotten. The great mills, once turning day and night to grind grain for the burgeoning population, now stood still, their water wheels moss-covered, their gears silent. Villages that once thrummed with life were now ghost towns, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold, their wells perhaps choked with leaves and debris. The usual cheerful sounds of human endeavor were replaced by the lonely cries of wild birds and the low rustle of wind through abandoned homes. This silence was heavy with the absence of millions. The initial period was one of stunned, numb grief. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving no one to mourn them or tend their property. Survivors often found themselves isolated, their loved ones gone, their communities shattered, facing a strange, bewildering loneliness. The sheer scale of loss was almost incomprehensible, beyond the capacity of human language or emotion to fully articulate. A quiet numbness settled over the land, a collective trauma too vast to process. One of the most immediate and visible effects of this terrible demographic collapse was on labor. With perhaps a third or even half of Europe's population gone in just a few years, there were simply not enough hands left to till the fields, to shear the sheep, to weave the cloth, or to man the shops. The survivors, the laborers who remained, found themselves holding unprecedented, sudden value. Economies lay in ruins, not from lack of money, but from lack of people. Prices for agricultural goods plummeted due to the lack of consumers and the abundance of land, while wages for skilled and unskilled laborers alike soared dramatically. The old, rigid feudal system, which tied the peasant to the land and kept his wages fixed and low, was mortally wounded. How could a lord force a serf to stay and work for pennies when a neighboring estate, desperate for hands, offered double the pay and freedom? This shift, while eventually leading to vast improvements for the peasantry and the common worker, initially created immense dislocation and uncertainty among the aristocracy and the merchant class. Lords watched their estates fail and their ancient revenues dwindle. Kings and parliaments attempted to stop the economic revolution by force, issuing statutes of laborers that attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels. But the iron law of supply and demand, enforced by the biological reality of depopulation, proved far more powerful than any royal decree. The Church, too, mourned the loss of its human capital. The decimation of the clergy left gaping voids in the spiritual landscape. The few surviving monks and priests, exhausted and grieving, faced the impossible task of spiritually guiding a profoundly traumatized population. The urgency to replace the lost meant that new clergy had to be ordained quickly, often with less rigorous training, drawn from lower social strata than before. This pragmatic necessity further eroded the intellectual caliber and the moral authority of the ecclesiastical structure in the decades to come. The sense of legal and social order was severely compromised. Courts could not sit because judges, clerks, or witnesses were dead. Local governance vanished in many areas. This vacuum of authority, combined with the sudden wealth and mobility of the laboring classes, led to a temporary but significant loosening of social strictures. The survivors, in their grief, often spent lavishly, investing their new earnings in better clothes, better food, and better housing, a profound and visible defiance of the sumptuary laws that had for centuries kept the classes distinct. The most profound change, however, was psychological and spiritual. The relentless presence of death had forced people to confront their own mortality in a way few generations ever have. The memento mori, the medieval artistic and spiritual reminder that you too must die, was no longer a cautionary tale in a sermon, but a stark, ever-present reality etched onto every empty chair, every abandoned house. This led to a deeper, more personal introspection about life's ultimate meaning. The ephemeral nature of earthly existence was thrown into terrifying focus. The old comforts, the predictable rituals, the certainties of the social order were gone. What remained was the raw individual soul facing its creator. The quiet, reflective hours after the plague's peak were filled with deep existential questions. Why did I survive? Was I chosen? Do I owe God more now? Is my life henceforth a borrowed one? These agonizing internal debates led many into a state of melancholy and deep piety, resolved to live a life worthy of their inexplicable salvation. For others, the trauma left a scar of cynicism and deep distrust. They had witnessed the failure of authority, the collapse of charity, and the hypocrisy of survival. They had seen the indiscriminate cruelty of fate. For them, the silence was simply the confirmation that the world was arbitrary and that the grand promises of eternal order were fragile illusions. This skepticism, too, became part of the plague's indelible legacy, quietly sowing seeds of secular thinking. The silence that descended was not absolute. It was punctuated by the lonely cries of orphans seeking their guardians, the quiet despair of widows trying to run farms alone, and the slow, tentative sounds of rebuilding efforts. But beneath the surface, a profound, irreversible shift had occurred. The old certainties had been shaken, the grand tapestry of European life ripped and rewoven. In that vast, echoing silence, the seeds of a new era began to stir, an era defined by a new economic relationship to labor, a deeper questioning of institutional authority, and a profound, often desperate, personalization of faith. The destruction was total, but out of the ruins, the fragile, uncertain work of renewal began. The time for lamentation was drawing to a close, and the time for finding new spiritual meaning was beginning. From the deep, echoing silence of the plague's immediate aftermath, a different kind of sound began to emerge, faint at first, then growing stronger. The quiet stirring of faith being rekindled. It was not always rekindled in the old, assured ways of the pre-plague era, but in forms perhaps more personal, more immediate, and more profoundly felt. The trauma of the Black Death, while devastating beyond measure, acted as a spiritual forge, reshaping and refining the relationship between the surviving soul and its God. The initial shock and the failure of the old institutional remedies had certainly shaken many. But for a great multitude, the very experience of confronting death so intimately, of surviving the seemingly unsurvivable, led not to atheism or abandonment, but to a deeper, more fervent engagement with their faith. If life was so fleeting, if death could strike at any moment without warning, then preparation for the afterlife, securing one's salvation, became an even more urgent and personal obsession. This wasn't simply a return to old rote rituals. It was often a more intense, internal and demanding quest for meaning and salvation. The contract with God was renewed, but on more desperate, more demanding terms. Imagine a simple woman, perhaps a widow named Agnes, who had lost her husband and 3 children to the sickness. She might not fully understand the complex Latin theology debated in distant universities, but she understands loss. She understands the silence of her home. She finds comfort not just in the formal, diminished Mass offered by a terrified new priest, but in her own quiet prayers by the hearth, in lighting a candle for her lost loved ones every evening, in the simple, deliberate act of charity to the beggar outside her gate. Her faith, born of suffering and refined by fire, becomes a deeply personal anchor, a private sanctuary when the public church seemed vulnerable. This era saw an increased and profound emphasis on individual piety, a movement of the spiritual center of gravity away from the cathedral and into the home. People sought a direct, unmediated connection with God, rather than relying solely on the vast, often corrupt, institutional church as an intermediary. This yearning for intimacy manifested itself in new devotional practices. The practice of meditation and contemplation on the Passion of Christ gained immense popularity. Lay people began to acquire devotional books, even simple tracts or prayer cards, seeking to visualize and internalize the suffering of Christ and the saints. The focus was intensely emotional, a spirituality of feeling and empathy. The survivors needed a God who knew their pain, a God who had bled and suffered just as they had seen their loved ones suffer. As noted before, the imagery of Christ's suffering, the man of sorrows, gained profound resonance. People could look at his open wounds, his crown of thorns, and his agonizing death, and find a sense of shared experience, a divine compassion that validated their own misery. His promise of resurrection, the hope of eternal life beyond earthly suffering, became a blazing beacon for those who had seen so much death. It transformed the focus from the terror of final damnation to the hope of eternal reunion. The plague also had a subtle yet powerful impact on the veneration of saints. The saints associated with intellectual life or distant political power waned in importance, while those who offered tangible, immediate help soared. Saint Roche, the tireless plague nurse, became a virtual superstar in devotional culture. Churches dedicated to him sprang up across the continent. He was the perfect post-plague saint, one who suffered the sickness himself, survived, and dedicated his life to caring for the afflicted. His story validated both the fear and the self-sacrifice of the survivors. There was also a dramatic, visible, renewed focus on charitable works. Those who had survived often felt a profound, almost crushing sense of gratitude, a feeling of having been inexplicably spared. They saw their survival not as random luck, but as a mandate from God, a form of spiritual debt they were now obliged to repay. This spiritual debt translated into action. Large sums of money were bequeathed to the church, yes, but often with specific instructions to build new hospitals for the poor, to establish almshouses for widows and orphans, or to found colleges and chantries where priests would perpetually pray for the souls of the deceased. These were not merely acts of piety, they were tangible expressions of a rekindled social faith, attempting to heal the wounds that charity had failed to close during the plague's darkest hours. The foundation of new educational institutions was an important spiritual act. Many of Europe's great universities, Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg, Krakow, were founded in the decades immediately following the Black Death. These institutions were often established because the plague had killed off so many scholars and teachers, creating a desperate need for intellectual renewal. It was a spiritual investment in the future, a hope that knowledge and reasoned theology could once again provide the certainty that mere fear had destroyed. While the institutional church had suffered losses and faced deep criticism, it too adapted to this shift towards a more personal piety. New forms of religious life gained strength. The mendicant orders, the Franciscans, Dominicans, and later the Carthusians, who focused on simple living, preaching to the common people in the vernacular, and ministering directly to the poor and sick, gained immense popularity at the expense of the wealthy, cloistered monasteries. They offered a more accessible, relatable form of spirituality, meeting people where they were, in their raw grief and their yearning for tangible evidence of Christian commitment. This spiritual energy was deeply conservative in its ultimate goal, salvation, but radical in its execution. The profound sense of being alone with one's God, the necessity of personal reckoning, the intense focus on scripture and devotion, all these factors quietly undermined the reliance on the elaborate institutional machinery of the church. It nurtured a spirit of individual religious inquiry that, while seemingly harmless at the time, was a key, slow-burning preparation for the great reform movements that would arrive a century and a half later. The rekindling of faith was not uniform, nor was it without its continuing complexities. The trauma of the plague left a shadow of morbid preoccupation that lingered in devotional practices. Death was not forgotten. It was embraced and ritualized. The macabre artistic trends, the intense focus on sin, the dramatic penitential acts, these showed that the renewed faith was still deeply scarred by the terror it had survived. But at its heart, the movement was one of endurance. The immense suffering had stripped away complacency and superficiality, revealing a deeper, more urgent, more personal need for spiritual meaning. In the quiet resilience of human hearts, amidst the ruins of the old world and the uncertainty of the new one, faith, often bruised but never ultimately broken, began to find new expression, preparing the ground for centuries of profound spiritual introspection and eventual renewal. The soul had survived the great darkness and was slowly, tentatively, searching for the light once more. The Black Death, a brutal, indiscriminate chapter in human history, did not merely pass. It left an indelible physical and spiritual mark, a legacy that rippled through centuries, fundamentally reshaping not just the religious landscape, but the very fabric of society, economy, and culture. It was a crucible that forged a new world from the ashes of the old. Perhaps the most profound and immediate long-term legacy was the irrevocable shift in power dynamics between labor and land. This was a direct, inescapable consequence of the massive depopulation. With up to half the populace gone, the medieval axiom that life was cheap and land was precious was violently reversed. Labor became scarce and therefore incredibly valuable. The common peasant, who had long been tied to the land and subject to the whims of his local lord, suddenly found himself with unprecedented bargaining power. If a lord refused to raise wages or ease rents, the peasant simply left, knowing that a neighboring estate, desperate for hands to sow and harvest, would offer better pay and better terms. The market, enforced by scarcity, was now on the side of the poor. This slow, often tumultuous shift in the value of human life ultimately contributed to the weakening and eventual collapse of feudalism across Western Europe. The fixed, rigid social structures of the Middle Ages could not withstand the fluidity created by death. Kings and parliaments, as noted, tried to legislate against this change, issuing harsh laws attempting to limit wages. But these laws were widely ignored, proving ultimately futile against the sheer force of demographic reality. The result was the gradual rise of a more mobile, market-driven economy. Peasants gained freedom, purchasing land or negotiating fixed-rent leases instead of labor service. They ate better, dressed better, and lived in greater comfort than their parents ever could have dreamed. The economic floor rose dramatically for the surviving lower classes, creating a foundation for a new, broader middle class. Economically, the plague led to a strange, dark form of innovation. With labor so scarce and expensive, there was a desperate incentive to develop more efficient farming methods and labor-saving technologies. While this process was slow, it laid the groundwork for advancements that would eventually increase overall productivity. Guilds, too, though initially devastated by the loss of masters and apprentices, adapted by creating more specialized crafts and tightening their internal monopolies, furthering the growth of mercantile organization. But the shadow of the plague permeated cultural and intellectual life most deeply. The relentless focus on mortality, the memento mori, became a dominant theme in all forms of art and literature for generations. This was not just a passing trend, it was a profound societal preoccupation with death. The danse macabre, or the dance of death, became the most powerful visual metaphor of the era. It showed skeletons leading people from all walks of life, pope and emperor, merchant and milkmaid, in a grim, endless procession. This art served two functions. It was a terrifying reminder of death's power, yes, but it was also a comforting declaration of equality. If everyone must dance with death, then the peasant was as important as the king. The hierarchical structures of the world meant nothing in the face of the ultimate judge. This intellectual focus on the equality of death directly contributed to the changing relationship between the individual and the divine. The perceived failure of the institutional church to adequately protect or even explain the plague fostered a more personal, critical, and direct spirituality. Why trust the elaborate, distant hierarchy when every rank of clergy had died equally and their rituals seemed impotent? This burgeoning individualism in faith was a slow, quiet, but powerful consequence. People began to question established religious practices and to yearn for direct engagement with Scripture. This trend of seeking a personal, unmediated spiritual authority was a key, slow-burning preparation that laid much of the groundwork for the future Protestant Reformation, which would explode 2 centuries later. The seeds of Luther's challenge to the papacy were sown in the fear and skepticism born during the Black Death. Even education underwent a subtle but important transformation. The massive loss of intellectual capital, scholars, university masters, and highly trained monks created a deep void. To replace them, the emphasis slowly shifted toward lay education. New universities were founded, and more positions in academia and administration were filled by laymen rather than solely by those destined for the church. This gradual diversification and secularization of knowledge was a quiet but powerful legacy, slowly pulling intellectual life out from under the total monopoly of the church. Think also of the impact on language. Before the plague, Latin was the undisputed language of the church, of learning, of law, and of power. But with so many learned Latin speakers dead, and the need for new priests and clerks to be trained quickly, the use of vernacular languages, English, French, German, in writing, sermons, and legal documents increased dramatically. This elevation of the common tongue was a monumental step, bringing both faith and learning closer to the people and away from the exclusive domain of the elite clergy. Even urban planning and public health were affected, though progress was painfully slow. The devastating impact of the plague in crowded, unsanitary cities led to a rudimentary, growing awareness of contagion and sanitation. While understanding of Yersinia pestis was centuries away, cities like Venice and Florence began to implement rules for quarantine, garbage disposal, and the burial of the dead, recognizing the dangers of close quarters and unhygienic practices. This was the humble, anxious birth of the idea of public health responsibility. The Black Death was not merely a historical event. It was a pivot point. It shattered old systems, challenged deeply held religious and social beliefs, and compelled humanity to adapt, to question, and ultimately to rebuild. Its silent, devastating touch stripped away the certainties of the medieval world, but in doing so, it left behind an undeniable spirit of pragmatism, individualism, and inquiry. The focus shifted from the perfect eternal world to the imperfect yet powerfully present human world. The legacy of the plague is the essential, terrible truth that life is fragile, authority is fallible, and the only constant is change. It was the necessary, agonizing transition between the settled, ordered world of the High Middle Ages and the dynamic, questioning, human-centered world that would emerge in the Renaissance. The survivors were not merely mourners, they were the unwitting architects of the modern age. In the quiet aftermath of such an earth-shattering event, with the old world shattered and the new one yet to be built, the surviving faithful turned with a renewed, desperate intensity to the enduring wisdom of their sacred texts. For Christians, the Bible, that ancient living testament to humanity's triumphs and tribulations, offered not only solace, but also the only established framework through which to understand, or at least grapple with, the incomprehensible suffering they had endured. The echoes of the plague can be found not as literal prophecies of the year 1347, but as a deeper, agonizing resonance within familiar millennia-old verses. The texts spoke a language of catastrophe and survival that perfectly mirrored the lived experience of the Christian world. Consider first and foremost the Book of Job. Here was a narrative that resonated with the very soul of the survivors. Job, a righteous man, stripped of everything, his family, his vast wealth, his health, afflicted by painful boils and boils that must have seemed chillingly similar to the plague's buboes, his agonizing questions to God, his struggle to reconcile his undeserved suffering with his profound faith, became the central theological question of the age. The survivors listened to Job's friends attempting to explain his misfortune as punishment for sin, a direct reflection of the sermons they had heard preached during the plague's height. But they also clung to Job's ultimate perseverance and his agonizing yet faithful refusal to curse God. The story offered a powerful narrative of endurance and unwavering loyalty amidst suffering that seemed arbitrary and meaningless, transforming the reading of Job into a communal meditation on trauma. Next, the Psalms, those ancient Hebrew songs of lament and praise, took on a terrible, immediate new meaning. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Psalm 130:1. This would have been the heartfelt cry of countless individuals kneeling beside a cold hearth or a fresh grave. The Psalms provided the vocabulary of grief that the survivors themselves lacked. Specifically, the Psalms describing pestilence, divine judgment, and pleas for mercy were recited with desperate, heartbreaking hope. Psalm 91, a psalm of protection, became particularly vital. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. These were not abstract phrases. They were descriptions of the invisible enemy they had just faced. Reciting these verses was an act of both desperate petition and profound, enduring hope in God's ultimate shield. The prophetic books of the Old Testament, particularly those of Jeremiah and Lamentations, offered a terrifyingly familiar visual landscape. Their vivid descriptions of cities laid waste, of weeping and mourning, of fields lying desolate, perfectly mirrored the reality of plague-stricken Europe. The imagery of desolate streets, the scarcity of food, the abandonment, the cries of the afflicted, these were no longer abstract ancient descriptions, but horrifyingly familiar, recent scenes. The suffering of Jerusalem became the shared suffering of Florence, London, and Paris. But the greatest solace was found in the New Testament, with its overarching theme of redemption through suffering. The image of Christ on the cross, enduring immense physical agony, symbolized a God who intimately and personally understood human pain and biological torment. His presence as the man of sorrows, suffering alongside humanity, was the ultimate counterpoint to the terrifying distant judge described in apocalyptic sermons. His promise of resurrection, the certain hope of eternal life beyond earthly suffering, became the single most crucial beacon for those who had seen so much death. It transformed the fear of the end, the moment of death, into the hope for the new beginning in heaven. The gospel offered not an explanation for why the plague happened, but a promise that the plague was not the final word. The parables of Jesus, emphasizing charity, mercy, and caring for the sick and the poor, would have simultaneously served as a crushing reminder of the failure of Christian society during the worst of the epidemic, and a powerful call to action for the survivors. The quiet heroism of those who did offer help, the anonymous acts of compassion, were seen as the truest fulfillment of Christ's command to love one's neighbor. Finally, the haunting, powerful imagery of the Book of Revelation gained intense resonance. With its apocalyptic visions of plagues, seals, and bowls of wrath, it lent a terrifying sense of cosmic, predestined significance to the Black Death. For some, it might have suggested the impending end times, further fueling both the fear and a renewed, desperate urgency for spiritual preparedness, a life lived on the very edge of eternity. The echoes in Scripture, therefore, were not always straightforward answers, but they provided a sacred language for grief, a framework for agonizing questioning, and, most importantly, a solid, enduring foundation for hope. The Church, having struggled to maintain its physical and institutional authority, found its true, unshakable strength in the texts that spoke directly to the terrified individual soul. The ancient words, illuminated by the brutal, unforgettable light of their own recent history, became more than just stories. They became a profound source of meaning, a whispered affirmation of divine presence in a world that had seemingly gone utterly silent. The survivors were now charged with carrying this renewed personal understanding of the sacred into a world transformed. As our long journey through the shadows of the Black Death draws to a close and the candle flickers low, we are left not with a tale of mere despair, but with a series of quiet, profoundly enduring lessons. This invisible plague, in its brutal, terrifying simplicity, peeled back the layers of medieval society, revealing both the terrible fragility of human life and the indomitable power of human resilience. The quiet lesson begins, perhaps, with humility. The Black Death taught humanity in the most devastating way possible that despite all its grand cathedrals, its political ambitions and its burgeoning knowledge, it remained utterly vulnerable to the unseen microbial forces of nature. It violently punctured the illusion of absolute control, reminding people of their small, temporary place in the vast, mysterious order of the world. This humility, though born of immense suffering, ironically fostered a deeper, more urgent appreciation for the preciousness of life itself. For each breath drawn without pain, each sunrise witnessed, each moment of simple, unbroken human connection, the world became more vividly present because its existence was no longer guaranteed. Then there is the lesson of interdependence. When the plague struck, it exposed how intimately connected every single person was to their community, to their neighbors, to the very fabric of society. The actions of one, a fleeing merchant, a brave nurse, could affect hundreds. The well-being of the whole depended directly on the well-being of its parts, a social unity enforced by contagion rather than by law. And in the face of such overwhelming adversity, those who extended kindness, who offered comfort at the risk of their lives, who buried the abandoned dead, revealed the enduring sacred power of compassion. These selfless acts became the most tangible testament to the divine spark within us all, proving that the Christian ideal of charity could survive even the ultimate test of self-preservation. The plague also taught a deep, agonizing lesson in the enduring quest for meaning. In the face of random, overwhelming, and indiscriminate death, people did not abandon their faith or their search for purpose. Instead, they deepened it. They questioned, they prayed, they sought answers, and in doing so, they were compelled to forge a more personal, more intense, and ultimately more internalized relationship with their God. This personalization of faith, this demand for a direct spiritual line that bypassed the visible, fallible church structure, was perhaps the greatest seed sown by the catastrophe. It was the quiet, profound beginning of a shift in the Western mind, the first step towards valuing the individual conscience and the private spiritual journey above the mandated collective ritual. The most poignant lesson is one of transformation. The Black Death was not a final end, but a violent, necessary catalyst. It shattered the old, rigid feudal world, yes, but in doing so, it cleared the ground for new growth and radical change. It sped up economic and social changes that might have taken centuries to unfold, contributing directly to the decline of serfdom, the rise of a mobile labor class, and the eventual necessary shift in intellectual focus. From this darkness emerged a new spirit of inquiry, a deeper focus on the reality of the human condition, which would later fuel the energy of the Renaissance. The survivors, through their sheer will to rebuild and their new valuation of human labor and life, became the foundation upon which a more dynamic, human-centered civilization was reluctantly constructed. So, as we tuck away the history of this profound plague, let us remember not just the suffering, but the immense, quiet strength of the human spirit that emerged from it. The quiet lesson is that even when faced with unimaginable darkness, hope persists. Faith, though tested and reshaped, finds new ways to bloom, and humanity, though humbled by its own fragility, continues its slow, uncertain journey, forever learning, forever adapting, forever seeking the light in the deepest shadows.
We may not face the Black Death today, but the lessons of endurance, compassion, and the sanctity of life remain eternal. These are the quiet gifts left to us by the shadows of the 14th century.
May your own journey into slumber be peaceful, your dreams serene, and your heart filled with the quiet wisdom of lessons learned through time. Good night.